having our first speaker for the morning of this was our devotion that we always have on Tuesday morning with Joe. And now we have Randall Price, who is, I can't read with my glasses on, who serves as president for World of the Bible Ministries. And he is a biblical archaeologist and retired Liberty University Distinguished Research Professor. Dr. Price has led people all over the world through his archaeological digs, guided tours, over 100 Middle East trips under his belt. And he has written many books and articles, been part of documentaries, and a frequent conference speaker. And he has also served on the board of the Pre-Trib Research Center for many years. Today he will be speaking on rebuilding the temple as an end-time sign. Now, he wrote his PhD dissertation at the University of Texas on this topic, and so that's why he also has like an 800-900 page book, come on up here, on this topic as well. So he's probably as good an expert as there is out there on this particular topic. So thank you, Randy.
All right, it's my privilege to always be here at the Pre-Trib conferences. Been here at every one except one. We were in excavation in Israel, and I couldn't be here. But this is always a joy of our heart each year. So our theme is the signs of the times, and we're looking at one of those signs that has been with us for quite some time, but progressing. And I thought, as I was looking for resources for this, a secular publication, it had this cartoon. Now, well, that's the way the world thinks right now. Wherever you go, there are people greatly concerned about what's going to happen. It doesn't matter whether you look at our country and the economy and the questions of governance and the deep state and all this stuff happening, or you go to Europe and see really problems there with things, or China and collapsing economies, or Russia at war with Ukraine, and just in the Middle East, of course, all of this is a concern. So the end is near, is the thought. And I thought, what could be our response to that here at the conference? Well, here it is. He's right. Okay. So, if we're looking for signs of the times, and these are the times of the signs, one of the great ones is the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount has looked somewhat like this, at least that 35-acre platform in the center has looked like this since around 691 AD, when the Muslims erected the Dome of the Rock on top of that structure. That was the place where the ancient Jewish temples, both the first and the second, and then the phase 2 of the second stood through the Herodian construction. And so now, as you know, this has been conversation at least since around 1987, when some of the temple movement organizations began, and the first intifadas as a response came from the Palestinian side that we need a third temple. The question is, why do we need a third temple? Aren't things okay as they are? The status quo on the Temple Mount has been the Jews below, the Muslims above, at least since 1967, with no access for religious purposes for Jews to the holiest site they have on earth. But that has seemed to serve Israel okay until, well, let's say October 7th. And we'll get to this. But first I want to just say, look, we're talking about end-time prophecy. And the third temple is important for end-time prophecy because the Bible reveals that a new temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem. They be part of the most significant events of the tribulation and the millennial kingdom. Current events that prepare for its rebuilding are signs that that signal event of the temple is near, and with it the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. So just some ideas about this. We know the temple will be rebuilt in the first half of Daniel's 70th week. We know the sacrificial system will be renewed at the temple, according to Daniel 9:27. We know the Antichrist will invade the temple and desecrate it with the abomination that makes desolate. We know that Christ will at his second advent come to deliver it. That's what it says. Behold, the servant whom you've waited will come speedily to his temple. And then Christ will purify and rebuild the temple for the millennial worship. So as we look at this, let's look at some of the prophecies related to the current even Temple Mount. We know that the Jews would return in unbelief to Jerusalem to reclaim their heritage and their destiny. For those prophecies we just spoke about to take place, there had to be a preparatory work, that is, bringing the Jews back to the land. And you see this in a passage like Ezekiel 36, 24. Beginning with verse 22, it says, talking about those scattered among the four corners of the earth, it says, I will bring them back, I'll return them to the land, all this, restore them. But then it says, after this, then I will sprinkle clean water on them, I will put my spirit within them, and they will be made new. And the picture there is first a return to the Lord, a return to the land, and then a return to the Lord. So there's a phase program. So that's what we've seen happening, at least since, I would say, somewhere in the 19th century through the 20th century, and now into the 21st. And then Jerusalem would regain its national status as the capital of Israel. Because when you read Matthew 24 in the Olivet Discourse, it talks about in that day, and it talks about Jews being in Jerusalem and fleeing from there, but not on the Sabbath day. So it means you have to have Jerusalem under Jewish control and a government, and with Orthodox somewhere in control to even have the Sabbath as mandated. So these are all things that would happen. And then Israeli Jews would rebuild the temple. That would be the final stage of this return. And then with that, Jerusalem would again be threatened by Gentile nations. Because as God returns to Israel and takes his place, it means for Satan the end is imminent, and therefore he is going to bring all the nations against Jerusalem in particular to destroy it. And that's where we come to all our end time scenarios. Now, just a quick overview of the Temple Mount prophecy. There's always people who are here who have really never walked through this to understand it. So just in a few slides, I want to give that background. First, we have the covenant that is made in Daniel 9:27. It talks about a firm covenant. Hegabir is the term for doing that, either strengthening the covenant or ratifying the covenant or something like this, with the many for 1 week. That's with the Jewish leadership. And so you have this military figure who we come to know as the Antichrist is going to make some kind of a covenant or a treaty or some kind of thing with the Jewish leadership so as to have peace, to guarantee them peace and security that they've not known while the rest of the world is at war. And that's what happens during the first 3 years of the tribulation period. And then it tells us that during this time we call Daniel's 70th week, a period of 7 years, that the temple will be rebuilt, and it'll be under this kind of false pseudo-peace, but then at the midpoint, there'll be a desecration of the temple as the Antichrist asserts himself, showing how very much he betrayed the confidence of the Jewish people. He was a false Messiah, if they actually see him as a Messiah. And the temple's desecrated. That leads to the last intensified 3.5 years of the tribulation, in which the temple is considered desolate from a ritual standpoint, but Christ will come. So as we look at this, it tells us in Revelation 11:1 and 2, describing what happens, though the part of the temple, the outer court, is not measured in God's perspective here, because it's going to be given to the nations, that is to the Antichrist and others, who will tread it underfoot for 42 months, the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. And from that midpoint, we know that the Antichrist will exalt himself above every so-called God or object of worship, according to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. He will take his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. And so this is that pivotal act of the Antichrist, which he calls the world to worship him. And his false Messiah, through miracles and wonders and signs, points to him as that figure. And that's what I think 2 Thessalonians 2:11 calls the lie. Some of our versions say what is false, but it has the definite article. It's clearly pointing to an event or an act that people have embraced, and that's the worship of the Antichrist. They've said no to Christ as the only Savior, and therefore there's nothing left for them. That's why they cannot be saved, because they've thrown in all of their allegiance to the Antichrist himself. And so that's the deluding influence that comes upon them, of course. If you move into the darkness, you just become darker. There's no light in the dark if you don't move toward the light. And then we have, in this time of the Great Tribulation, the attack of the nations against Jerusalem. And Zechariah, of course, tells us about that, all that will happen. And at the climax of that, the Lord Jesus will return, not directly to the Mount of Olives. We know he comes Basra, to places where the Jewish remnant has escaped. And that Jewish remnant is his intention to save his people. And then he goes finally up to the Mount of Olives. And it tells us that it splits, and of course that split goes right through the Temple Mount. It separates north-south, but creates this east-west valley of escape for the Jewish remnant who are held up there to get away from the assaulting army in the Valley of Jehoshaphat, which today is there in Jerusalem, Wadi Joz. If you ever go to that area, you'll see Wadi Joz, and that's simply the Arabic form of the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Well, coming to that, then we have the rebuilding of the temple, and it becomes the center of God's purpose for Israel and the world. The nations attack it because it represents God's plan for his people, the place where Israel's Messiah will one day rule over all the earth. So that's just a brief rundown of the temple and prophecy, why it's important, because this is what God is about to do. Now, how is he going to do it? Well, he has signs. Back in around the medieval period, 12th century or so, Maimonides, the codifier of the Mishnah, put it this way. He said, if a king will arise from the house of David who diligently studies the Torah and observe its mitzvahs and prescribed by the written and oral law, as did David his ancestor, if he will compel all of Israel to walk in the way of the Torah and rectify the breaches in its observance and fight the wars of God, then we may consider him the Moshiach. If he succeeds in the above and builds the temple in its place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, he is definitely the Mashiach, okay? And so moves from there. So Maimonides kind of set the pattern for this in terms of modern Jewish rabbinic thinking. And so the idea is Messiah, welcome to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and establish your eternal kingdom. So on their time frame and their chronology is very similar to ours, but with a very different understanding of who that messianic figure will be. If you want more information on this, I've written some books, one on the temple and Bible prophecy, the thick one Tommy talked about, and then another one that our Friends of Israel publishes called Jerusalem in Prophecy, a couple of books on the temple as it existed in the past, and then other things related to the temple treasures. So these are just things, we have them on our table out here if you're interested in learning more, that's accessible. So you look at a chart of the temple through time, you see there's a first temple, there's a second temple, there will be a third, and then the millennial temple will follow that. So where are we in time? We're right here. We're at the time in which the body of Christ is called a spiritual temple. It will be taken in the rapture, just as the physical temple was taken by the Romans in AD 70. The physical temple will return once the church, I think, is raptured, although we may see the signs of all this, or the beginnings of this, while we're still here. But this is something that is for the age yet to come. So this is the way I look at things. Dome of the Rock will be replaced, of course, because it's a pagan structure and for ritual purposes could not exist. This all was brought to my attention and to Tommy's attention back in 1992. I'd been to Israel. We saw the beginnings of the temple movement. We saw people dressed in priestly clothes going down to the pool of Shiloh or Siloam, what they thought it was in those days, the Byzantine pool, and getting water to take back up to the temple area. Oh, they couldn't go to the temple area, but they were reenacting the water drawing ceremony. It was part of the Feast of Tabernacles. And I thought, this is very unusual. And I went and I joined them and I took pictures of them and I came back and I wrote an article and shared that with Tommy. He said, you got to put that in a book. And I said, I don't know how to write a book. He said, well, I do. So that's how we got started. So it was Ready to Rebuild, but it's been a long time since Ready to Rebuild. Since then, I wrote another book called The Battle for the Last Days Temple because it dealt with the conflict over the Temple Mount. So all these things have been progressing. So the preparations to build the third Jewish temple in Jerusalem have intensified over the decades. Small things like making the implements and the vessels for future temple worship, or finding people qualified to be priests or Kohanim, or to train Levites and all kind of things, and find the red heifer. All these things have been ongoing things. You've seen them in the news. I just want to, as we look at this, if you were going to Jerusalem today, one of the first places you might be taken is to the Mount of Olives to look at this vista. And one day that vista, of course, will change. And a third temple will stand there. I don't know if we'll go as tourists to see that. I'm sure we won't, but others may. But I want to talk about the signs of the sign of the temple. How will we know? So I have 5 things I'm going to walk through with you right now. And first is a new recognition. A religious war for the Temple Mount that has moved us to a new direction in all of this. And then second, a new response. Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount, a place that was formerly forbidden because of the status quo agreement is now open. There are 50,000 Jews praying there during the high holidays. When I was there in September, I didn't see one Muslim on the Temple Mount. It was just full of Orthodox Jews. That's quite a change. And then a new revival. Preparations for the Messianic era. People are really talking about this, even seriously preparing for this in a way they never had before. A new reality, sovereignty on the Temple Mount. It's being asserted. It's not quite there yet, but there are calls for it, as you'll see. And then a new resolve, ready to rebuild in a way never before. So let's walk through these. And what I want to do is I want to be kind of a news broadcaster. It's much easier to show you than to tell you. I'm not like the younger guys that can put the videos out, but so a lot of pictures here. But I've taken news articles, headlines, things like this, and put them together to build this. So just kind of follow with me. So first, a new recognition, a religious war. And if you look at all of the things being said, particularly in the Orthodox community, but in others too, they're looking at this as really a holy war. You know, the other side, the Muslims, are looking at it as jihad, which is a holy war, but they see it as a holy war too, defending the holy sites, and particularly the Temple Mount. Now we go back to June of 1967, when the Dome of the Rock and all of this, having been there 1,300 years, was kind of contently under Muslim rule, but Israel was attacked from many quarters by many nations, and as a result, they defended themselves. And the result was that within 6 days, you had Israel regain these territories. But just think, wouldn't have any of the problems we have today if people had just left it as it was. Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip. Syria occupied the Golan Heights. Jordan occupied the West Bank, okay? And they had what they wanted, but Golda Meir said, you know, it wouldn't have mattered. They had everything they wanted, but what they didn't have was Israel. That's why it was called the Palestine Liberation Organization. They weren't liberating these other places. They were liberating what was claimed to be the land of Israel. And so in 67, this all came to a head. Israel, I think in a very miraculous way, won the day. The Temple Mount returned to their control. It was a celebratory thing. Some of those who were there on that day became part of the temple movement. Israel Ariel was one of the paratroopers that came in. He, and with others, but primarily he, founded the Temple Institute, which was designed to try to prepare for the rebuilding of the temple by making it possible to carry out all of the service of the temple through the vessels needed to do that. And so that was his side. Another individual at the time, Gershon Solomon, also there on the Temple Mount, he started the Temple Mount Faithful. And in the past, you might have seen things he did, created the stones, cornerstones for the third temple, also kind of a competitive organization, but doing some of the similar things. Israel Ariel's with us, Gershon Solomon is gone, but in his time he was an activist leading people to raise the consciousness of the public for the need of a temple, that we're really not free, we're really not doing what God wants. We're still in exile until we can come back to our holiest place and do what God told us to do. That is, Exodus 25:8, let them construct for me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. And so this was the push. And for that reason, the Temple Mount became the most volatile 38 or 36 acres on earth. Because everybody said it was theirs. It always has been the holiest site in Judaism, the only holy site in Judaism, I might say, but for Islam, it's probably the third, maybe the fourth, depending on whether you're Sunni or Shia or whatever. But you see the propaganda here. The Islamic holy sites are occupied by the Zionists. They're trying, and none of this was true. There were never hordes of Muslims coming from Mecca, as this shows, to come into Jerusalem. There never were. I had a friend who tried to get tourism for Muslims to Jerusalem, and he got some to come finally, and they brought them from one of the countries trying to get through Egypt, and they stopped the bus, and they wouldn't let them pass for like 2 weeks through Egypt, and finally when they got into the West Bank, then Palestinians stoned the bus. So these are Muslims coming to worship at Al-Aqsa. Okay? They wouldn't let them in. There was no way you could do tourism there because they didn't want to somehow dignify that or whatever. But from this picture, it looks like the Israelis had the place covered with barbed wire and shooting it. This is all propaganda, of course. But around 1987, it was the beginning of the Al-Aqsa Intifada. We've had two, we're in a third now. But this Al-Aqsa Intifada, meaning the uprising against things, was construction. Everybody was kind of sort of getting along until this, and then mandated the closing of shops and all kind of things, and violence and stone throwing and all of that. It kind of hit its climax after Ariel Sharon went to the Temple Mount, and they claimed there was a second intifada called the Al-Aqsa Intifada. And the climax of that was this last April in 2023 when violence broke out again on the Temple Mount with Jews going up to worship or other problems. So this is where we've been, and it's because of the growing threat the Muslims claim to have perceived. This was considered the cause of the October 7th massacre. Now, and people, of course, tried to justify it as resistance and all kind of things, which is absurd. Rape is never justified. Killing babies is all the things that were done is completely unjustified. And but this is what was said. So here was the co-founder of Hamas, Mahmoud al-Zahar, saying Jewish prayers are a blatant attack on the religious and Islamic status of the holy city. Even though the status quo agreement started in '67 was a shared site. Okay, now not originally for religious observance for all people who considered this holy, but as soon as they tried to assert that in '67, the Muslims said, "No, you can't pray here," to the Jews, and so that's why they were relegated to the Western Wall below, and it's been that way. But this is what happened on October 7th. 2023. It is a renewal of the Holocaust. You remember a whole generation that only heard about the Holocaust. They had relatives that were in the Holocaust, but it was not a perceived reality to them, and now it is. They've had their own Holocaust. And through the auspices of the Friends of Israel, I went as part of the board on a solidarity trip this last September. We got to see these things ourselves, to go to the sites where the deaths occurred and all the young people's faces are displayed. And we talked to first responders, we talked to members of Zaka, who are those who clean up the remains of these terrorist attacks. And just so you could come back and say, I was there, I know it's true, it happened. Nothing like this has happened for Israel since the Holocaust, and so we've turned a new chapter in history. But you can see how there was rejoicing and praising throughout the Islamic world, hailed as a victory. They called it the Al-Aqsa Flood. They said, we've achieved a victory in the battle for Jerusalem. All the headlines were saying things like, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the focal point of the Israeli-Palestinian tensions. It's the start of the Al-Aqsa deluge or flood. They've been talking to the Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank in solidarity with Hamas, and they all are. As far as we know, ideologically, none of them differ with that. And they justify October 7th. The Grand Mufti was calling for masses to inflame Temple Mount tensions. So whenever there was some kind of thing during the holidays or whatever, get involved, do these type of things. And you can see when you look at Hamas or other Palestinian organizations, at the center of their logos is the Dome of the Rock. And you can see liberation of the Dome of the Rock or the Islamic holy sites only through jihad. That's what the crossed swords are all about. And if you look at all of the logos of all the organizations, they have something like this at their center of it. And since October 7th, we've seen this spread throughout the Islamic world. Here you've got banners and posters and all kinds of things talking about the focus of this whole attack is, of course, we call the Temple Mount, and they call it Al-Aqsa. You have more of this. Here was a giant poster in Beirut, Lebanon. I don't know if that's still there, but you could see as people drove by how they were all praising the central structure in Islam. One of the most egregious ones was this that was found on the computer of a secretary in Alejandro Mayorkas's operation. And just as on October 7th, you had people with these paragliders come in and massacre the youth, they showed the same thing happening in Jerusalem, as though that were a good thing. And so this is the kind of thing that's been going on, not just in the Palestinians, but also with others. Before all this, Turkey's Prime Minister Erdogan had an obsession to take Jerusalem. He has called on Muslims to protect Al-Aqsa. He himself has said it's time to take a physical stance on Israel, meaning invasion. The Iranians produced a film which showed a Muslim invasion of Jerusalem like this, and Erdogan has shown this in places. His ambitions is to create a new, basically Ottoman Empire, resurrect this, and with that would have to have Jerusalem as its center. And since the fall of Syria, he's eyed that as part of being fit into this agenda. So here's some recent headlines. Tension at Al-Aqsa Mosque is deepening with each day of the Israel-Hamas war. Or Erdogan saying the Muslim world must unite against Israel. And he said that to Iran's Rassi. Or here's thousands of Iranian soldiers stage a mock siege of the Temple Mount. Kind of a flimsy little Dome of the Rock there, but that's the idea, to show this kind of thing, what could happen. And one of the news channels said, did Iran attack the Temple Mount? Well, no, it hasn't, but they did fly drones over it, and very indiscriminately, so they could have, in a sense, attacked the Dome of the Rock. We know that Russia, Iran, and Turkey have alliances together, politically, militarily, and that sets the stage, as some have said, for the end-time war against Israel. We know what Ezekiel 38 and 39 have told us. We won't debate the timing of it here, but it simply says there will be a future invasion of Israel with these primary leaders. The power from the north, which is Gog of Magog, and will be also the Persia, which is Iran, and then all these other nations. Many of them are part of the Turkish empire now, but also places like Yemen, which has the Houthis involved today. So much is happening to set the stage, and we should be aware of that. Now, what's happening with Israel? Well, as I said, this first point deals with a war for the Temple Mount. And you look at the Israeli side, an IDF soldiers, it's never really been the religious focus of people out in the field. But now you have rabbis coming out, you have Torah scrolls everywhere. These guys in particular have a patch, and in Hebrew it says something like that, speedily in our day or soon in our day. It talks about the rebuilding of the temple, and they wear it on their uniforms. And I'll show you some more of that too. And they say, why are you fighting? What are you fighting for? We're fighting to make the temple a house of prayer for all nations. So they clearly make that statement that this is what they're there for. Here are some things I drew from some of the Temple Mount organization sites. You shall obliterate the remembrance of Amalek. So they see this as a holy war. This is the enemies of God and his temple. You shall destroy him, have no pity on him. Here's some guys in a tank holding that up so we can rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. So in Israel's army, more officers are now religious. The percentage of officer cadets who are religious has grown tenfold since the 1990s. The IDF struggles with rising influence of religious Zionism. This is without the Hasidic element even being involved. Even though they want to be drafted, they're not there. This is just, even among seculars, one secular institution, the IDF has this Jewish awareness branch that helps soldiers weave together Jewish military values. That's a new thing. So here's some scenes from the field. Reading the Torah scroll, blowing the shofars, observing morning prayer, daily prayer, all of this kind of stuff. That's our new scenes from the field. The silver trumpets for the battlefield for IDF combat soldiers based on Numbers chapter 10. If you go to war in the land against an adversary that poses, you shall blow a Torah with the trumpets and be remembered before the Lord your God and be saved from your enemies. I mean, this is a new perspective. This is not just the hardened soldiers, the secular, atheist, Israeli. No, they really see there's more to this than just defending the nation. Here are these patches and banners. They're on tents. They're on tanks. All that say this about the temple. We're going to make for ourselves the temple. We're going to do these things. So on the back of helmets, here's patches on uniforms as a guy actually goes to the Temple Mount to pray. So all of this is part of what we're seeing. So this is an image courtesy of the Temple Institute that shows the tank right there with the temple in the background. Here are some of the soldiers, again, holding up the implement, wearing it, saying, that soon we are fighting so the temple could be rebuilt, so that sovereignty will return to Israel. So here, just to kind of summarize this section of it, you can see some of the images that are presented online, the solidarity between soldiers, the prayer for going to the Temple Mount, the idea of the priest, interspersed with the jets, it's a very interesting, I've never seen this before in any of Israel's wars. That's all there. And found this graffiti written on things, which simply says, build the temple, Yivnei HaMikdash, or the battle in Gaza is the war over the Temple Mount. Kind of graffiti places so that people remember what it's about. And here it says, we can surely go up and take possession of it, for we can indeed prevail. And a picture of the troops. And if you remember, back in 67, Madi Gur had his troops up on the Mount of Olives and said, the Temple Mount is in our hands. And the picture here is of the soldiers in the same place, but now with the realization the temple will exist. Well, that's the war that is in the minds of people for the Temple Mount. But there is also a new response, and that is prayer and Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount. And so when I was there in September, we took some pictures. It was really remarkable to go up there and see hardly any Muslims anywhere. It was primarily Jews with their escorts of the police and prostrating themselves this way. Wherever you were, different places that are considered places that are not going to violate the sanctity of the site, stretched out. Normally, you would see Muslims praying at Ramadan. You notice the position. Mecca is this way, and they're praying toward Mecca, and the temple is the other way, and they turn their backsides to it. So it's not as, of course, the place of reverent prayer as it is for Jews. A number of people have promoted this through the years. Yehuda Glick is one. He actually made it to the Knesset. He worked with the Temple Institute at one time, then made it to the Knesset and wrote a book about rebuilding the temple and gave it to Netanyahu. And he was shot 6 times by Muslims, and they didn't kill him. And so I guess what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I was with him this last summer, but he has been leading people up there to walk barefooted, because you can't go with shoes that are leather, because that would be a symbol of death and that would be considered unclean. So they have a prescribed area that they walk. That way back in 67, someone like Rabbi Goren determined the right places to walk. So here you see this happening. So let me just run through some of these. Discreet Jewish prayer continues on the Temple Mount. First slowly, but then since October 7th, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the Minister of National Security, said there is no more a status quo. Jews can go pray on the Temple Mount. And he said this because already back around the year 2000, you'd had the building of the Al-Mawani Mosque, which had violated the whole status quo. They had banned Jews from coming up there. All this changed things. So now, on this basis, he said Jews can go pray. Now, Netanyahu pushed back and said, no, but that's what they said do. So here's his pictures. He's leading Jews up there to pray. You can see the headlines here: Israeli extremists who want to rebuild the temple, and the government ministers who back them, this kind of thing. Half of Jewish Israelis back prayer on the Temple Mount, mostly to prove sovereignty. So there's been a change, I think, in the perspective of just the secular Israelis. Before, this was a provocation, and they didn't want to cause trouble. They didn't see it as important. They weren't religious. They were secular. But now they see that the battle they're in and the lives that have been lost and the Holocaust they've suffered is because of the Temple Mount issue, and the very fact that they don't have sovereignty in their country, at least not in their capital city and not in their most holy place. So the feeling is we've got to change things. So you can see, raise an Israeli flag, build a synagogue, Ben-Gvir said. Netanyahu overruled him, but Gvir still come back and ignored Netanyahu. So these last high holy days, you had 50,000 Jews ascend and pray on the Temple Mount. Never since Israel came back to the land have we seen anything like this. And so it's for the first, and you see Glick in this picture on the side, standing there with the army soldiers. Much less seen soldiers on the Temple Mount, but see soldiers praying on the Temple Mount. That's even more remarkable. So the first time in Al-Aqsa, they performed the Sukkot Musaf, the morning prayers. I mean, actively there, doing something that was considered completely forbidden and should have brought, according to the muftis, the drop of every single Muslim's blood to defend this holy site. And there's no one doing that. It's kind of strange. They're not. The war that they said was over this really isn't taking place here. So you can see the people praying. You can Orthodox and Hasidic as well. You see some of the people who are considered part of the priesthood with the sign of the sheen praying there. Just as in the days of the temple, they would prostrate themselves in the court of Israel. Here you see people prostrating themselves and praying that way. And here's a number of pictures. Some I took. We were there. People just prostrating themselves. They can't get, they can't pray on the Dome of the Rock. There's problems because they don't know where the Holy of Holies actually is, and they don't want to desecrate it by treading there, but they get as close as possible. So everywhere you look, you see Jews praying. And this is a new response to what is happening. So Ben Gvir said he scorned Prime Minister Netanyahu's objections. He said, it's my policy, and we're going to just continue doing this. And recently, just as you can see, this is just from a couple of days ago, Knesset member Simcha Rothman called for the chief rabbinate to permit ascent to the Temple Mount. Everybody, let's make it official. So moving from this idea of prayer as a new response, we come to a new reality. Temple Mount sovereignty. Will the Temple Mount return to Israel's complete control? And if that happens, and they have complete control, what does that mean? They have complete control. It means they can do what they want to do. And if the mind is there, then they could rebuild the temple. Back in 67, Jews were relegated to a small section of the Western Wall, which the Muslims called Al-Burak Wall. They didn't even call it the Western Wall. They said this is where Muhammad tied his celestial steed Al-Burak when he made the ascent to heaven. And so this is not a Jewish wall at all. It's Al-Burak Wall. So, they claimed that. There is no place. And I said Madi Gur stood on this very place and said the Temple Mount is in our hands. On the site, soldiers went for the first time. These young guys, when they were born already, the Temple Mount was off limits to them. They could only see it from a distance, and now they came. And that's why Rabbi Goren proclaimed in 67 that the Messianic era had already begun. He went inside the Dome of the Rock, and we know now, this wasn't known at the time, we know now, after his death, and some of these things have been released, that he pleaded with leaders to blow up the Dome of the Rock at that time to rebuild the temple. And they saw that as too much of a provocation, and even threatened to put him in jail. But he did get access to the site. He went there with the Army Corps of Engineers. He measured everything off. They thought they had forever. That's why they didn't go underground and do other things, but they didn't. And I met with him back in 1993, shortly before his death. And all of this, he just said, this was our plan. We wanted to do it all. And we were forbidden to do it. Now, why did that happen? Well, Moshe Dayan, who was one of the leaders in the Six-Day War, stepped in, not with Israeli, permission. He just did this unilaterally. And he came in and sat down with the Muslim authorities in the Al-Aqsa Mosque and just turned it over to them. But he himself said he intended and expected the Jews would be able to pray there. Because after all, we have sovereignty over the site, he said. He didn't realize that making that one concession would lead to all concessions. And that's what happened. He said, we'll live here in fraternity. Well, it was naive in some ways, but here are the reasons he returned control of the Temple Mount. This is from his own book. I'll just put them up here. He said, it's a danger to the state of Israel. They barely won the Six-Day War. They are afraid that they could be taken over by massive hordes of Muslims in the world. And so he said that we needed this to defend the state of Israel. And then demonstration of the Arab world that we are not like them. If they had taken this from us, they would have kept it forever and kicked us out. But no, we're not going to be that way. And so we're going to show them a demonstration. And then the international community was denouncing everything Israel did. As you know, they never accepted Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. They never accepted the West Bank. It was always disputed territory. The consequence of the Six-Day War was not accepted by the international community. And so he knew that, and he wanted to placate that. And then the decree of the chief rabbinate, they said, look, we as Jews don't know where the holy sites really are. And if we were to go up there, inadvertently we'd tread on those sites, we'd desecrate them, and the result is, so we can't go up. No Jews are permitted to go to the Temple Mount. And Diane said, well, if you can't go up there anyway, why are you going to fight over it? We'll just stay where we are. So it was the Jews below and the Muslims above. And that resulted not just in a geographical or topographical distinction, but also a contested view of the holy sites. What they call the Dome of the Rock, which we call the Temple Mount, or the place where the temple was built, they call by other names, the Wailing Wall, Western wall, everything was different. Nothing really was Jewish. And you can see this in Palestine revisionist history. I'll just read one quote here by the chief Palestinian justice, Sheikh Tassar Tamimi. He was the most important Palestinian cleric after Mahmoud Hussein, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem at the time. He said, Israel since 1967 started making archaeological digs to show Jewish signs to prove the relationship between Judaism and the city. And they found nothing. Now, he hasn't read those reports because they found plenty. But he said they found nothing. There's no Jewish connection to Israel before the Jews invaded in the 1880s. You see, Jews were never in the land. They only came as interlopers in the 19th century. Isn't that amazing? But this is what they're taught in schools. About these two so-called temples, they never existed, certainly not on the Temple Mount. That's not real. We don't believe any of your versions. The Torah was falsified. So, that's the position they come from. This position that young children are taught in Palestinian schools, and that's why they're basically all radicalized. And it's very difficult to start again. So Gavir said, Al-Aqsa belongs only to Israel. Can you imagine this statement? The Muslims say Al-Aqsa is only for Muslims. He said it's only for Israel. So now we really do have a contest here on things of concerning sovereignty. Throughout the marches that you see places, hands off Jerusalem, or things like this in Turkey where you have the Dome of the Rock, people in handcuffs and all of that. Or here's some others. Jerusalem is in danger. We've got to save it, Or here's some, hands off Jerusalem again, all pre-printed signs. But Jerusalem is for Palestine always and forever, not for Israel. So you can see the statements being made. And you understand why Jewish sovereignty is needed now more than ever. So this is what we see going on. Abbas, who is with Fatah, the supposedly moderate Palestinians, but exactly the same as Hamas in reality, even though a contest over who would have control. Netanyahu says the Temple Mount is insoluble, but we may be moving to change that. People educating Jews on the importance of the Temple Mount, and then others like Rabbi Ariel coming up on the Temple Mount and explaining these things, having Yom Kippur services there, talking about things. It's quite an amazing thing to see all this happen. Signs not to ignore. And so you see the Muslim position on the Temple Mount weakening and Jewish sovereignty being asserted. Expressions of Jewish nationalism. You would not see an Israeli flag on the Temple Mount, but you see them now. And you see soldiers up there praying. And you see people on the back of his shirt returning to the Gaza Strip. I mean, now that we have the Palestinians out, Israel returning, assert sovereignty there. Or the Temple Mount being for Jews. And not just, look at the normality of this. Jewish families with kids in strollers going to the Temple Mount. You would never have seen this. It's an amazing thing. Here's some group photos, Jewish families on the Temple Mount, okay? And this woman in her interview was saying, the war we are waging is a war for the Temple Mount. So this is leading, in my opinion, to a new revival, preparation for the Temple era. And so in this new revival, here's what is happening. The Sanhedrin has been reconvened, whether you think it's legitimate or just kind of a staged thing, whatever the case. It existed in the Second Temple period. It condemned Jesus to the cross. This is the place where the Sanhedrin meets. It was built by Rabbi Gorin back in his day. They've convened there, and their goals have been to locate the original temple, the site of it, to locate a descendant of King David, which they think they found, establish Jewish monarchy, which is not yet here because that comes with, of course, a whole change in government, and then erect a temple, an altar on the Temple Mount. What they've done, they've been building vessels for a third temple. This has been in the works. Many of you have seen all the pictures of the garments and of the vessels and the things that have been done over a period now of some 30 years. These are on display in places if you go to Israel or Jerusalem. But we've also had the creation of a priestly community. People from birth being trained to be Kohanim and priests, and Levim, the Levites. Levites leading worship. Some of this you think is just, reenactments and just for fun, but no, they're deadly serious about this. These people believe this is their life calling and career. They're involved with, yes, working with models and things at present, but only so they can work with the real thing someday. Working with all the things you'd be doing in the temple, involved with these aspects of it, even to a sacrificial altar that is movable. It comes apart and you can take it from place to place. So you have seen things like that as Jews revived the ancient Shavuot, or Feast of Tabernacles ritual, near the temple. They can't do it at the temple, but they do it near the temple with that idea involved. Or offering animal sacrifices, again, in that place. Now, these are all things that have happened. That was a Feast of Tabernacles. Here's a Passover offering reenactment. Or in this case, performing Shavuot, the Pentecost service, there with a paschal lamb and all of this. So this makes the news, but you can see what they're doing. They're trying to say, this is where we belong. You have the Levitical choir now that has been done, and they do concerts. Here is a concert that was done in the Jerusalem Archaeological Park recently. You have this Levitical choir perform in different places, and they do it according to what they think they'll be doing when they perform in the temple itself. Well, last but not least in this little list is the red heifer and the third temple. You've heard different things about it. Maimonides had said that 9 red heifers were prepared from the time of Moses, and the last red heifer that would be used would be when King Messiah would come. And he said, may that be speedily revealed. So this is the excitement over the red heifer. Numbers 19 is somewhat cryptic, but the ashes of the red heifer are necessary to purify the people who perform the service and the vessels used in the service. So that's what we're doing. As you know, here in Texas, we delivered red heifers to them in Israel. There was always the idea the red heifer had to be born in the land of Israel, because you can't put a yoke on the red heifer. You can't have blemishes on the red heifer. So therefore, how are you going to get a red heifer somewhere if you can't really move it? So the idea, they had frozen embryos at one time, all kind of things, but they brought these red heifers. There's 4 of them now situated in Shiloh, at the settlement there, kibbutz there, and they've arrived. I'm just putting headlines up here. In a West Bank settlement, Israelis 10 red cows and plan for the third temple. Or U.S. evangelicals, the cows and the second coming. See how they even tie those things together. And this is the Texan who helped bring the red heifers there, Brian Stinson. Red heifers at Shiloh, just chowing down, enjoying themselves. They don't realize in their age of 3 they can be burnt and used for the red heifer ceremony. And this is the idea that's coming. Believe it or not, they even have the young priest who supposedly has been raised in such a way to be qualified to offer the red heifer. So he is there posing. So where we are on this, nobody really knows, except that they believe that the heifers are finally qualified and the time is near. I won't enter into all that debate, but it's, again, we're looking at a sign of the times. And it's a sign when we come to something like this. And this hasn't escaped the notice of the Muslims. Hamas spokesman Abu Ubaidah reveals, we attacked after the Jews imported red heifers. So they see this, it's kind of like, if you are Jewish and you come to faith in Messiah, okay, there's a lot of Messiahs out there. You get baptized, well, that's another thing. Now you have crossed over and accepted another God, and so things change. For them, once they got serious about bringing the red heifers in, which is the step needed to actually do the deed, they took this very seriously. So October 7th, hidden reason is revealed. The red cow, the baby cow. How much of this is really the cause or just the spoken cause, I don't know. But this has been announced as the cause. Here, holy cow, can 1 red heifer herald the third temple? Holy war, red cows, and red heifers arrive in Israel, a signal of the third temple, end times. So you can see how what this is all progressing. First red heifer in 2,000 years fulfills Bible prophecy, these kind of things. Well, finally, we have a new resolve. And the new resolve is to build the temple and build it soon. And that's the new resolve. Not just build the temple, but build it in our lifetime, in our generation. And that's what we are seeing happen. In Mishnah Yoma, it says, each generation that does not rebuild the holy temple is as if that generation destroyed it. So the feeling is that we are obligated. Jews are obligated. So rebuilding the temple, you have to have blueprints. Blueprints exist. They've been out there for some time. Some people just catch up with that reality. There's just some pictures of what might be the case. But the idea of rebuilding the temple based on actual blueprints of the second temple, because the third temple they know is for the Messianic era. Even though they believe this will usher in the Messianic era, they believe an interim temple is necessary and they can do it, but they have to have the plans, and the plans existed both in Tractate Midot in the Mishnah, and also with Josephus and with the Bible and other things, other events. So Israelis who take the third temple seriously say these are the days of the third temple. You really see an escalation in this talk. Israelis call for rebuilding their temple and returning to animal sacrifices. The Temple Institute encourages Jews to hope for a third temple. They put a new video out where they're actually with a crane dropping the thing in place. And then, of course, with the election of President Trump and others, Pete Hegseth, at one time they found him in an old interview that seemed to call for a Jewish temple at Al-Aqsa. He basically just simply said, nobody knows how it can be built, but it probably will be built someday. It wasn't a call for that, but I don't think he's against that necessarily. But they see these kind of things, people be put in place in the Trump administration that could see this possible, okay, especially as Secretary of Defense. So the question is, will the current war result in Israel occupying the Temple Mount as the first step toward rebuilding the temple? And you see these things they publish, looking forward to the day after. We're all looking forward to the day after Israel's defeat of our enemies, wherever they may be, to the south, to the north, to the east, to the west. Building the Holy Temple, a house of prayer for all nations, is the only peace plan that can and will succeed. The Holy Temple now more than ever, as what's being said. And you see the little signal on the back of the helmet there. So the call is for rebuild the temple today. Israel must end the status quo on the Temple Mount now. This is the call. This is important. So we have Israelis set aside a new Jewish temple on the Al-Aqsa site, or a third temple preparations in full swing. I'm just reading these headlines here. And of course, they look at Trump as being significant. In Israel, you had, after his election, these signs, Trump make Israel great again. Well, how will he do that? And many have said, will Trump facilitate the building of the third temple? This is a hope. As you know, in the past, a coin was minted with Trump and Cyrus's face on it that he would fulfill. This was the previous time when he was in office. And are Jews ready to rebuild the temple? All they wait now is for permission. This is the political side. And with people like Huckabee moving to the embassy, they're all just rejoicing. We got everything in place. The permission is due any day. So the second coming, brought to you by who else? Donald Trump. This is negative reports. So they said, anyone happen to know where I can get hold of 13 young bullocks, 2 rams, 14 yearly, all that kind of stuff. Precondition for the end times and the rapture and the second coming set in motion by the proclamation from Donald Trump. All right. So it's not just our side, it's all sides looking at this, seeing that. So let me just, as we conclude, think about this. What could the end of the war hold for Jerusalem and the Temple Mount? Just kind of thinking together. Will Israel decide that peace is only possible if Jerusalem and the Temple Mount is under Israel's exclusive? It may seem a radical prospect, but nothing has shaken Israel in the past 75 years like the new Holocaust they experienced from their Palestinian neighbors, who have continued to praise October 7th and call for Israel's destruction based on its occupation of Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount. So with that in mind, what could people think? Well, linking the October 7th massacre and the cause of the war could justify asserting Jewish sovereignty over the Temple Mount, because it's not going to end unless we change things. Otherwise, the same terrorists will oppose Israel within its capital city. Now the status quo on the Temple Mount has ended, at least in a practical sense, Israel may secure Judaism's holiest site to maintain its security against countries that seek to invade Jerusalem to control it, like Iran and Turkey. If they're all saying we're going to take it, then it's all the more important for Israel to take it to defend against that. And then there is now no reason to fear Islamic provocation. This was always the thing. We'll provoke the Muslims. We'll provoke the Muslims. Keep it quiet. Stay off. Well, there's no reason to worry about it. They're provoked. Trust me out there. So the reason since 1967 that Jews have been banned from the Temple Mount really no longer exist. Jews may ban Muslims from the Al-Aqsa just as Muslims ban Jews. Just thinking through it, all right? Could such plans be a catalyst for a greater Arab invasion of the city of Jerusalem as described in the War of Gog and Magog? Just a thought out there. And as someone has said, could the rebuilding of the third temple be a sign that the rapture is closer? Well, I don't know about theologically, it'd be closer, because rapture has always been a set time. We may be getting closer. It's not getting closer, but all right. But here it says, the suggestion that the rebuilding of the third temple and related escalating conflicts could signal the approaching rapture is not unfounded, especially as we examine the prophetic links, historical context, and tensions of influential global forces. Well, thinking about that, let me just say, the church needs to look at the signs of the times. That's what we're doing. But beyond that, its real focus is not on what is coming, but who is coming. And we always need to keep our eyes on the clouds and say, even so come, Lord Jesus.
Okay, thank you, Randy. Questions, line up and let her rip, as you know.
Hater chip. Yeah.
Go ahead. Yep.
Hi. So you mentioned briefly the Sanhedrin believes they have found an heir of David. I was just wondering, because of the temple destruction in AD 70, the temple records would have been destroyed as well. Right. Is it possible for them to identify an heir, and if so, how?
Yes, so how is because we know that the house of Hillel, which didn't lose its status or records, was considered of Davidic descent. So they can trace it through that. And so there's whole groups who claim Davidic descent today, and they meet regularly once a year in Israel and Jerusalem for kind of like, shall we say, a family gathering. So there are a great many possible candidates, all of Davidic descent, based on this tracing through the house of Hillel.
Thank you.
Yeah. Robert, okay, over here.
The first time I visited the Temple Institute was in the early 2000s. And at that time, you would have a docent that would walk you through and, you know, here are the robes, here are the snails that we got the color. It's not like now when you just sit and watch a video. But one thing she said was this. She was a young Jewish lady. She said, when they give us the go-ahead, we can rebuild the temple in 3 days. And of course, that kind of struck a chord in all of us.
Yeah, because that's
Christians.
what,
Yeah, and
he was speaking of the temple of his body, different one. So.
Yeah. Well, she said that. She's Jewish. And
Yeah.
I've been thinking about it. And could that possibly mean that maybe that's a tabernacle? I mean,
Well,
you know.
okay, so people have thought about we can just set a tent on the Temple Mount and that will do. But and possibly that could. I mean, in the time of the Second Temple, they just constructed an altar, and so you had a functioning temple. And it was 15 years before they actually built the structure that became the first Second Temple. But today, it's a different situation. All the stones you need for building the temple are right there. The limestone's all there. There are enough Jewish financiers. I've met a couple who said, I single-handedly could pay for the building of the temple. You have the blueprints done. You have the vessels ready. You have competition between these temple movement, who's actually going to pull it off. But everything seems to be in place. They've worked through all the details, how to use electricity in the temple when they didn't have it then, and all the laws. And so there's from their perspective, they have a priesthood ready to function, and Levi'im ready to function. Again, are they going to do it exactly the same way in the right way? That's internal debate on their part. I'm just saying we are at a place where the readiness exists. 3 days doesn't sound right to me. I've always been told a matter of months, within 6 months, what I heard in the past. Because, I mean, if you have a concerted effort to build something and the whole nation's involved and everything is there, it won't take long. But, yeah, more than 3 days, I would imagine. I'm surprised she said that, but that's interesting.
She said that. I mean, we were all too shocked to ask, excuse me?
Well, there's a statement in Hosea, after 3 days he'll revive us. So maybe it's a prophetic, statement meant there symbolically. Yeah. Next.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Price, for a great presentation and updating us. My question has to do with the Messiah. Your last slide was, it's not as important as what is coming, but who is coming. Yes. What are the current thoughts of the Jews in Israel, to the extent that you know, about the Messiah?
Well, of course, they know quite a bit because a lot of it was written, but a lot of what they've written is wrong. So it's just a matter of, they know too much, but too much that isn't so. Primarily, the idea is that Messiah is a human being who has military, will be an interventionist, lead Israel to victory. If he does certain things that they believe the Messiah is supposed to do, then he'll be identified as the Messiah. But he's simply a human being. They don't, although you have Jewish text that certainly could be considered a divine Messiah. I mean, you see it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see it in some of the early rabbinic texts, you see it in the Zohar. I mean, there's a lot of things that lean that way, but they use other terms for that. The Memra, the Shekhinah, the Bat Kol. They use all these various things which we would say would be like Holy Spirit, or they just have different ideas. So rabbinic theology is caused of that. And so for them, the idea of our Messiah, a divine Messiah, is non-Jewish. It's a Gentile God, and that's why you can be an atheist and be a Jew, but you can't be a believer or a Christian and a Jew. So this is where we stand. That can change, of course, when God changes their hearts. We have a messianic revival during the tribulation. The real word goes out, convincing them through what God is doing. And, that because we have how many Jewish believers we have in this room, okay. And so you were convinced. They can be convinced too. So all that can change by the time we come to, they will look upon him whom they pierced. So that will happen. But today, there's not an understanding of Messiah. It's similar to ours. Same characteristics are there from Scripture, but only for a human being, not for someone who is sent by God or son of God or anything like that.
Right, but they're actively looking, or many are actively looking to rebuild the temple. Are they actively looking to find or develop or
they can't.
A leader?
I mean, they can't. How do you find the Messiah? It has to be revealed. So the whole picture of him coming down from the Mount of Olives, blowing a trumpet on a donkey from Zechariah 9:9 is one of the pictures they have. A humble, endowed with, concept of salvation. You still drive around Israel and see Rabbi Schneerson, uh, Schneerson, right? Yeah, everywhere, saying, "Hail King Messiah." Usually it says something like that. Just a human being. He died, but they believe he'll come back. And so, because there isn't anybody else for them. But it's, so this is the idea. So Messiah, but they said he would come to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, and he died before he could do that. He never even came to Israel. But the belief was that he was the right guy. That's not shared by the rest of Judaism, just by the Lubavitchers. But so they just have qualifications. But one of the real qualifications, who's going to get this job done? And that's why it's such a prophetic interest to see the Antichrist steps in and with the Jewish leadership give us this peace. And from that probably comes the rebuilding of the temple. Because in Daniel, what we see is the next act will be the cessation of sacrifices. So it had to have been built and resumed by that period. Yes, sir.
This is kind of a multi-part question concerning the timing of the temple. Is the temple going to be rebuilt, the third temple, according to Ezekiel's plan, or will that be the fourth temple? And plus, the two witnesses, they can do the animal sacrifices without a temple first, so that would be with a tabernacle, and then they can perform sacrifices? Or what's the timing of the sacrifices?
For sacrifices, you have to have a consecrated priesthood, and you got to have an altar. All right, so that's the main things. The structure around it is not as important. So that's why you only had a tent in the time of the tabernacle. Mm-hmm. You also needed the Ark of the Covenant originally, because the whole reason for building the tabernacle was to house the Ark of the Covenant. The whole reason for building the temple was to house the Ark of the Covenant. And that's missing at this point. I would say that in terms of the timing and all of that, you could resume any of the stuff they're doing now. If it were done on the Temple Mount and you had the ashes of the red heifer, according to Scripture, it could go ahead and be considered, the sacrificial system and the resumption of an operating temple.
Because I'd always considered that the two witnesses, the first things they would do is probably initiate animal sacrifices with or without the temple. But then I was also wondering, joining that, the temple is in Ezekiel, are those the plans they have for the third temple, or is that what we're kind of looking for that will be at the millennial temple?
Well, everybody that I've talked to in the temple movement is looking for a second or third temple that's an interim temple.
Okay.
They believe that the Ezekiel's temple has to come with the Messiah and be built in the clear Messianic era. But there's some confusion on that. But it would really be impossible to build Ezekiel's temple. The whole area is 30 times larger than what they have, and it requires, topographical changes, all kind of things according to the text. And they are textual. I mean, they're literal. They're not, so they don't have what that, and they also understand it operates under a new covenant, which they don't themselves operate under. So there's a lot of differences. So they're basically going to follow the plan they have. In other words, if any time in history that it was possible for them to rebuild a temple, it would be built on the basis of the temple they knew.
Okay. Right.
So that would be the idea.
All right. Thank you.
My question is about the geopolitics. Israel right now is in an agreement with some of the countries with the Abraham Accords. Do you have a feel how they feel about the Arab, how they feel about the temple rebuilds? Do you think they're going to break down relationship with Israel, or do you feel that they are slowly running around without saying too much?
It depends. I mean, the Saudis are considered the protectorate of the holy places, Mecca, Medina, and by extension probably all the holy places, although that's debatable because others claim that. They join the united voices of Muslims over the holy places. These are our places, we protect them. Don't know what would happen if it really came down to the Israelis came and took control. In the past, what's generally happened when that's happened is they just back off. That would have happened in 67. You know, Allah didn't defend this place. We lost. We have to regroup and figure out what's going on. That's what Nasser did. Couldn't figure out, you know, what are we going to do? I think there would be at least a holding pattern throughout the Islamic world to wait and see, because if the United States was backing Israel as well as some of Europe and others, if somehow the Islamic power base was denuded or, you know, tempered down, and it wasn't a fear factor, I think they wouldn't care. The nations. Now, the Muslims will always save face and, you know, say they're in solidarity, but I don't know if they would take action. It's just, it's not their way to do that. If you show strength and they respect strength, they don't act. You know, that's the safest course is always to have a strong position. And if Israel asserts its sovereignty, they're not going to go to have a world war over this.
So you think the destruction of the temple would not start really a big war over there in the Middle East?
Don't know, but it might not. Okay, I mean, I think there are times when it was possible to rebuild the temple, and if it had been rebuilt, I think it would be here now, and you wouldn't have had the reprisals. It's because Israel conceded and gave in that they took that and took liberty on that and built off that weakness. So it's hard to tell. I'm not, you know,
Time will tell.
that geopolitically astute on things, but just observing what's happened in history, I think that they could get away with it.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Price. In regard to the interim temple, if it was constructed in the near term, let's say during the Trump administration, would the temple need to be on top of the Dome of the Rock, or can it be off to the side? I saw one of your slides on that. So what's the current thinking on where the temple should be, I guess,
Well,
if it was near term?
Let me just say, from the perspective of all the Jewish temple organizations that think they're going to have a hand in doing this, as well as all the Israeli archaeologists, and most archaeologists that I know, they all would say the central location where the Dome of the Rock is. It may be a little bit to the west or to the north or something like that, depending on what they actually find out when they got there, but certainly not, you know, far to the north or far to the south or in the city of David. Okay, any of those places are just out of limits. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
He kind of asked what I was going to ask, but I do have one other kind of an interesting speculation. What do you think the animal rights people are going to do when they start sacrificing animals up there?
Yeah, well,
that may start the war, huh?
Well, they have plenty of them in Israel. No, they got a lot of those kind of people in Israel.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Tel Aviv is the gay capital of the world. We have the problems in Israel that we have here in many different ways, but they don't have control. It's a matter of who has control to do things. And they'll protest.
Yeah, I just thought it'd be interesting to watch and see, you know. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. What do you think of the possibility of some sort of an ecumenical structure? I know there are architectural plans for the church, you know, temple, tabernacle, you know, kind of thing, a Muslim thing, and that when you go to the Temple Mount, you can see that there is enough space between the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock to not with the Solomonic colonnade and everything, but at least the size of the basic, you know, Holy of Holies, holy place, and courtyard. There is enough space there right now for that structure.
Yeah, there's 330 feet between the temple and the Dome of the Tablets, for instance, in the north. And then if you talk about the Al-Qas Fountain in the south, even more. So the international community has always called for an ecumenical structure, a shared structure. It's never been even considered on either side, okay? First off, from the Muslim side, who opposes Jews coming to pray on the Temple Mount? Okay, Orthodox, or what we would call you know, practicing Muslims. Okay, if you were a liberal, you wouldn't care. Let the Jews come up. So it's the it's sort of the Muslim elite and the ones from the Waqf who are in charge of this, who are, we would call radical in that sense. They're opposing this. Who wants to build the temple? Well, not the secular Jews.
No, the religious.
The Orthodox Jews. Well, the Orthodox Jews won't go up where you have a pagan structure and pagan prayers and everything else. You have to have the whole place, you know, consecrated, sanctified by removing a pagan presence or a defiling presence. There's very strict laws related to these things, and so there's no way they could coexist from the Muslim side or from the Jewish side. Because the people who want to either maintain their place or want to take it over are both Orthodox in that sense, and they can't coexist.
Makes sense.
So there's ideas. You always see pictures of the temple next to the Dome of the Rock. You know how wonderful that would be, and Kumbaya, and everybody. No, but no, it's just not. It's not practical or feasible by Jewish law or Muslim law.
That's stuff from American prophecy land trying to help things out, you know.
And different prophecy teachers, for one reason or another, have bought into some of this. I remember when Chuck Missler was around, he's changed his view on the location of the temple 3 times. You know, So he and in my book, it's funny. Someone argued it was Sizer. Sizer had written a thing in his book critiquing me, and he said that I followed Hal Lindsey's view of the temple being built in the north, or it was Gershon Gorenberg. One of them said this. And Hal Lindsey didn't hold that view, and I didn't hold that view. You know, so it just shows how poor their scholarship was. And then, Chuck held to the north view with Asher Kaufman, and then he held to the southern view with Tuvia Segev, and then he held finally to Bob Cornick's view at the City of David, and now he knows better. So
Asher Kaufman was the only person that believed that, I think.
Yeah.
You know.
All right, there's still some others. How much time do we have?
Okay, thank you. You know, what can we do in light of all of this going on in Israel? What an exciting time we live in. There's opportunity. There are Orthodox Jews coming to the United States, going all over the world, building bridges is what they call it. And in the process, they are getting exposed to the work of the Holy Spirit. If you live in this area, there's a group called American Jewish Conservatives. You don't have to be Jewish. You don't even have to live in Dallas. You just have to be conservative and love Israel. It's run by an Orthodox Jew named Benji Gershon. He's a sweetheart of a guy. We've been members for several years, but you get to schmooze with the Jews. You get to speak with them. They come from Israel to speak with us. I've met Yehuda Glick. He is under this horrible calling. He is like determined that the Jews will have control of the temple site. This is God working on his Jewish people. It's always been us and them, but now we need to get with them and show them we truly love them because they are a part of our God's plan. I just wanted to say that if you're interested in American Jewish conservatives, come see me later, and they'll welcome you with open arms. You don't have to be Jewish.
We ought to take advantage of anything we can like that. In the book, Ready to Rebuild, put a chapter, should Christians support the rebuilding of the temple? And my answer was no, because the people who are involved with rebuilding the temple hate our Messianic brethren and basically use their efforts they can. They said, we are worse than terrorists. If you're a Messianic Jew, you're worse than a terrorist.
They're not all that way.
They're not all that way, but okay. So here's the way they thought. They thought as Christians show support for Israel and support for some of the prophetic concepts of rebuilding the temple and things like the restoration of Israel. They're moving our direction. They're becoming more Jewish.
Yes.
They're going to convert to Judaism.
Yes.
And we think that the Jews are moving toward our direction. And we should not be deceived by that.
You need to
All
know
right.
how to speak with them. You
You
need
do.
to speak their
You do.
language. You don't use church terminology.
That's
You don't
correct.
ask them if they're saved by the blood.
A
You
lot
don't
of it's
do that.
about fundraising.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's organizations that say Christians and Jews for this. And it's Christians because Christians give all the money,
Yes.
and that's why they're first in line. And they don't really care a bit about that. Look, yes, evangelical Christians have the perspective of some in Israel who know best, Netanyahu included, that evangelical Christians are our friends. All right,
Yes.
But as soon as you as an evangelical Christian start talking about them having faith in the Messiah, as we define it, you no longer are a friend. You
it's
can
a,
become
it's
an
a
enemy.
long process. You don't just start with Jesus.
No, I understand. And God works through our loving,
Yes.
reaching out,
Yes,
and the
He
building
does.
of bridges. That's a good thing. You can only build bridges so long and so far, and you always, from the beginning, have to be clear about your intentions. You know, so I don't want to deceive some. I just love Israel cause. No, it's not, because there's a lot of things not to love about Israel. You have to be very clear about that. But we love these things and stand with these things because God has a plan for Israel. And in the end, he's going to bring all the Jewish people together to embrace the Messiah and lead the world in the worship of God. So we need to understand that. And that's why we do it, not because we just have a Jewish heart and just, no, there's more than that. But I always want to be clear on that. But as you get closer to Jewish people, and most of them are as ignorant as can be. They're just in the community, in the club. You know, got a copyright patent on God. I don't need to worry about anything. But when you get deep enough to reach the fact that they're sinners and they need redemption through a Savior, and that Savior is only possible through the way Scriptures revealed him, the suffering Messiah, then you find out where you're going to be. And if they come to faith, now they have the challenge of leaving the Jewish community, being ostracized by family, all the things that they face as a result of that. And so realize what you're doing when you share the gospel. It's not
I'm
just...
almost 80. I think I know what I'm doing, but...
Right, but I'm just saying, it's like when you say, what is it, profit a man if he, gains the whole world and loses his soul.
Yes.
But for people who are in a community like this, and Muslims included, it means losing everything. And so someone would say, I'd rather lose, my soul than lose face or not be able to support my family or do these things or be part of my... So, that's why relationship is necessary. And what you're calling for is that, and that's good.
The church has always been separate from. The church stood by and watched the Jews during the Holocaust be slaughtered.
Right.
We cannot do that. We have to be Bonhoeffers.
Absolutely.
Okay, we got to move on to the next question.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yes, as far as the groups that are planning to build, do they have a consensus on building materials, what tools can be used, what machinery can be used, who can work on it?
Yeah, pretty much.
And wouldn't you like to be the contractor?
Yeah, but pretty much they do. The problem is you have rivalry between some of these groups, and they have their own ambition, and they built up certain organizations. And so, who's going to lead in this? Who's going to actually do this? And they've been, like, for instance, they've been making competitive groups and making vessels for the third temple. Whose vessels are they going to use? In the end, I guess whoever has the most money or has the best contacts or whatever, it'll happen. But, I'm not a contractor, but it'd be fun, yeah. Joe?
Yeah, how many different groups, organizations did you say are trying to rebuild the temple?
Well, in my book on the Temple and Prophecy, I have a list of the Temple Mount organizations. Well, anyways, I think I took it out for that. I have a book called The Coming Last Days Temple. It was a big paperback, and we put it in hardback and revised it. but I had a list of all the Temple Mount directory of the Temple Mount organizations. There's lots of them. And a lot of them have changed. There used to be a Temple Mount Yeshiva that no longer exists. There used to be, leadership's changes. Nachman Kahana used to be around. He's not there anymore. So there's just a lot of, but it's vast, and there may be something online about that. I don't know, but some of them work in concert, and some of them don't, and but they all have the same goal.
So we know more about the Temple Mount faithful because they're so.
Yeah, because they're out there. They've been trying to reach the public, just to say, here's what we're doing, and that also helps them get financing and do various things. Rabbi Richmond was from New Jersey, and he's an American that came over, and so in '87 he wasn't the spokesman then, but he became that. And Israel Ariel's kind of a reclusive guy, and he lets others run things, but yeah.